Hello, everybody, and welcome to Unlearning Economics. I have with me today Dr. Rosie Collington, who is co-author of The Big Con, How the Consulting Industry Weakens Our Businesses, Infantilizes Our Governments, and Warps Our Economies. So thanks for joining me, Rosie.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Before we start, I do want to say congratulations on finishing your PhD, which was quite recent, right? So I bet that must be a massive relief.
Yes, it was 2 weeks ago today I defended it. So it's been a pretty busy few years writing or researching a PhD and writing this book as well. So it definitely feels like a huge relief to be on the other side of it.
Yeah, because I looked at your PhD, and while it's related, it's not the same thing. And I actually co-authored a book while I was doing my PhD as well, and I really wouldn't recommend it to anybody. It's extremely stressful.
Yeah, it was a lot. But yeah, no, it was, I mean, both, I was very interested in both projects and both research projects. So I have no regrets, but it definitely was a lot more work than I kind of expected to go into when I started my PhD during the pandemic.
I think, yeah. I mean, that's a familiar story, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we've had all these scandals, right? Just sticking to the UK for now. G4S failing to deliver security during the Olympics, Boris Johnson's government messing up PPE and seeming to enrich their mates in the process, High Speed 2 being half cancelled, the NHS wasting billions on private contractors, Carillion construction collapsing. You know, to what extent do these massive failures in the UK and elsewhere have to do with the outsized consulting industry?
I mean, this is the question that we try to explore in the book. We recognize that there are, as you've just listed a few of them, in the past couple of years in particular, we've seen these huge scandals. Barely a day goes by without a consulting scandal making headlines in the UK or in other parts of Europe and around the world. But we were wondering, what is driving this? Are these the consequences of a few bad apples, or is there something systemic going on? And the conclusion that we really come to is that the growth of the consulting industry and the expansion of contracts with governments or by governments and other and businesses, but particularly with governments as the focus of the book, with consulting companies and other outsourcing companies, can really be understood through the lens of a broader transformation in government and the role of the state in the economies. So we argue that the consulting industry has what we say has ridden the wave of capitalism, and it's positioned itself very well to be able to extract rents as capitalism has transformed, as the role of government and the role of the state in the economy has transformed, and that's what we look at in the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's one thing to do a sort of journalistic takedown, right, and be like, these big corporations they're doing bad things and they're enriching themselves like all big corporations. But it's much bigger than that, right? The aim of your book, you're trying to talk about how the public sector has been hollowed out and governments have been left incapacitated, and the consulting industry has filled this gap, or maybe even encouraged it to appear in the first place, right?
Absolutely. And it's both of those things. So I think many or usually in academic literature and in kind of critiques of the consulting industry, the focus has been on either the failures of government to transform or to be able to deliver these policies effectively, to be able to act in the interest of citizens and all of these things, or the perspective that's taken focuses on the role of consultancies as these kind of agents of economic transformation and hollowing out. But we kind of argue that these two things are interrelated. And they're interdependent. So the growth of consultancies is in part driven, and the growth of government contracts is indeed part driven, or in part driven by the strategies of consultancies that they engage in to position themselves to be able to create the impression that they are able to create value for societies and for governments and for citizens. But this goes hand in hand with ideological shifts around and shifts in ideas about the role of the state in our economies, and the idea that civil servants are unable to fulfill these tasks, and governments are weak and therefore should be relying more on the private sector.
Yeah, some of these broader trends are definitely something that maybe I want to get to later. I mean, For now, I'm interested in the how they sell themselves, right? You mentioned it, right? Because they sell themselves as having expertise, as developing knowledge, but I mean through case study after case study, and some of them are kind of almost funny, if they, or they would be if they weren't so, tragic. But it's like that. It seems like some of these services, they're quite ethereal. They don't necessarily seem to add value. Very little is produced. So you're left asking, is there any real expertise here?
Absolutely. And it's not to say that there isn't expertise within the consulting industry. Absolutely not. We are very clear that there are very smart people working in this sector. There are very smart people working as consultants. And, there are also many people who go into consulting after having spent many years working in government or in the private sector and industry. But certainly there is, if we look at the kind of structural dynamics of the sector and the incentive structures of the sector, there is a tendency towards creating the impression of being able to create value, even when that is not the case. And that has the effect of, weakening government capacity because it's not contributing anything necessarily.
So there's this idea of economic rents, which you've mentioned, right, and which is mentioned quite a few times in the book. So economic rents are usually defined as a return to an activity that goes above and beyond the value generated. So the canonical example is usually landlords, right? It chimes with the everyday use of rent, right? You just own the land, you didn't produce it, you're sucking money out of the rest of the economy. But outside of that example, it can be quite difficult to define rent, can't it? It's easy to define in theory, hard to define in practice. I mean, how can you be sure that they're not creating value if they're, because the argument would go, well, if they're being paid repeatedly this much, then surely they're doing something.
I think we should start from the reverse or the kind of other or the argument that they are creating value, right? Which is the premise that this whole model is based on. This is the premise that the relationship between governments and consultancies is premised on. That's what the consulting industry will argue, that they are always creating value for societies. Now, we can challenge that both through using these kind of case study examples, but also when we look at, as we do in the book, the kind of internal dynamics of the firm, what motivates the pursuit of future contracts and how might that distort the ability to create value within these companies. And once you start to look at that, it becomes very clear this kind of argument or the hypothesis that these companies and that the sector exists on the scale and scope that it does today because it is creating value simply does not hold.
Yeah. I mean, do you have like a really good example of that playing out in practice?
Of the consulting industry extracting value.
Just like a specific one. I mean, I mentioned like G4S, right, and Carillion. I don't know if you have one that really neatly illustrates the extracting value general principle.
So, yeah, good question. I'm thinking of cases that we look at in the book. I mean, we look a lot at the involvement of consultancies in the pandemic and in and in government's pandemic response. So during the pandemic, government contracts to consultancies in the UK, but also in many other countries, such as France and the US, just skyrocketed. And many of, or in a number of instances, subsequent government inquiries as well as academic research has suggested that, actually the involvement of these consultancies was not enabling those organizations or those who were tasked with, implementing the vaccine rollout in France, for example, or developing the test and trace model in the UK. They had not succeeded in their objectives to help, break chains of COVID-19 transmission, for example. And this would be an example, or this case is probably quite a good one to look at in the case of rents, because we have to ask, well, also, why did these companies get these contracts in the first place? That after decades of investing in creating the impression that they have that they're after decades of positioning themselves in government contracts. They have developed this reputation, or established a reputation for being able to, deliver and fulfill these kind of capacity needs. And that is what enabled them to get the contracts in the first place. But they were not actually able to deliver on the things that they had promised to do. So that's probably a good case.
Yeah, yeah. When there's something actually physical that's to be delivered, and then it doesn't happen, then you can pretty confidently say that you're extracting value rather than creating it, right?
Yeah.
So are there so I mean, I opened with the UK. There's quite a lot of examples from the UK in the book, but there's examples from a lot of other countries as well. And I'm just wondering, with the twin sort of hollowing out of state capacity and the consultancy firms replacing it, are there countries which have successfully resisted this, which have retained their state capacity and maybe performed a bit better during the pandemic, for example?
So this is a good question. I would say, we know that, most or the most revenue that the big three and the big four make is coming from North America and Western Europe primarily. But there has been growth around the world, and I think it's Africa and the Middle East are the fastest growing markets for the consulting sector. But that not necessarily during the pandemic, but we can point to instances or things that some governments are doing when they have recognized that they have become dependent, or their ministries and government bodies have become dependent or more dependent on consultancies, and that this is having a kind of adverse effect on capacity and the ability to implement policies. So we do discuss at the end of the book, for example, in Denmark, which many people assume in the UK and elsewhere has probably a very meritocratic civil service, and has a quite extensive public sector. A review in 2019 found that even in Denmark, many ministries were or that spending on consultancies, on management consultancies, and also kind of external lawyers and IT consultants had skyrocketed. And so the government that came in 2019 introduced a cap on consulting spend, or said that they would slash spending on consultants in half. And as part of the process of doing this, they also established an in-house public sector consultancy to ensure that when government departments so that government departments that had been reliant on consultancies for specific tasks, like budgetary analyses, for example, would not have a capacity deficit. And I mean, the jury's out, because there hasn't been a kind of independent analysis of how well this is working. But by all accounts, it seems to be functioning reasonably well. Of course, it has been the case in the UK under Dominic Cummings, where the challenge to the reliance of consultancies became deeply politicized when Dominic Cummings, I was going to say, was in power. He, of course, was never in power, but was involved in politics. And he tried to establish, again, an in-house public sector consultancy there. Now, subsequently, when Cummings left office or was no longer involved in the government, this whole project and endeavor had just been completely associated with him, and so it stopped kind of receiving funding. And subsequent to that, we saw the UK government even lift the previous cap on consulting contracts that had existed. So we see a lot of variety, but definitely, Denmark's an interesting case that I think we'll see how it develops over the next few years.
Yeah.
The government of Australia at the moment, or the Senate in Australia, is led by the Green Party, also currently undertaking a big inquiry into the government's use of consultancies, and that includes a number of proposals for how to improve transparency and manage conflicts of interest when working with them. So again, I think there'll be some interesting things coming out there.
You're currently in Denmark, aren't you? You're at the University of Copenhagen. Are you sort of going to be looking at how that situation develops with the, I don't want to say eviction of the consulting industry, but the limiting of the consulting industry? Are you going to investigate that, do you think?
Yeah, so I'm at Copenhagen Business School, and many of my colleagues here also do research on consultancies. I'm not currently focusing, my current research is not looking at consultancies in this way, I'm focusing on the role of the finance ministries and economic modeling and green transition. So
Okay.
more closer to what my PhD research was on than the research that we were doing in the book. But I still have kind of contacts within the government, so I will be maintaining some definitely some kind of at least peripheral interest in this development.
I'd be really interested to see how it works out, right? Because it's like, presumably it's a very difficult process to reverse because as the capacity of the state gets hollowed out and people leave, and you talk about institutional memory, right, or institutional wisdom or something like that in the book, right? And so it's like it's really this almost irreversible process because once the state's lost capacity, then you can't just go back to it. You can't turn back the clock, right? So I guess it's like, I mean, what worries me is if countries like Denmark move away from it and then it doesn't work because of what I've just said, because it's really difficult to reverse, and then everybody just sort of ends up going back to it or something like that.
No, I think yeah, that's certainly true, and I think that's why the experiment in the UK has been a real shame because it was so deeply politicized and it was never really taken very seriously. As
Mm.
soon as it was seen to not be working very well, it was just scrapped entirely, right? I think in Denmark, it's after 5 years, this internal consultants, public sector consultant body. Or agency, it's based within the Ministry of Finance, is still standing. And at least the last time that I spoke to people involved with it, they were saving. It had also created kind of, even though it had been expensive to establish this new body or this new agency, it had also created, spending savings where these evaluations that had been done by consultancies previously had cost something like 10 billion kroner. I think that's probably too much, but they'd been very expensive. Well, 1 billion Danish kroner. I think 10. Yeah, I can't remember the amount. Anyway, they were a tenth of what they were spending, a tenth of what they had spent previously on this. So again, I'm very hesitant to say that it's working without having done
Yeah.
the kind of proper analysis, but my sense is that it does seem to be achieving so at least some of what it set out to achieve.
That's there's a spoken like a proper academic. That is, we need you to say something much stronger for like the YouTube clickbait title.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
So, I mean, with these industries, I suppose they so you've got industries like Amazon, right? You've got Jeff Bezos, you've got Elon Musk, you've got Bill Gates, even, right? They attract a lot of attention. Now, everyone's kind of vaguely aware of like KPMG. I think you could call KPMG, PwC, and McKinsey household names probably, but they don't seem to attract anywhere near the amount of ire or controversy, right? And I guess because of this conversation we're having in the book you released, which has done really well, that might be changing. But do you have any sense of like how they've managed to hide it for so long? I mean, I suppose this is the big con in a way, right?
Yeah, I think part of it, and then this comes to back to, the more fundamental question of why they're able to continue to secure contracts even after all of these scandals that we've been discussing. McKinsey's role in, I think that, again, I'm going to be wary of how I phrase this legally, but I think the term that was used is that they, helped to turbocharge sales of opioids in the United States. So they were involved, maybe advising on how to turbocharge sales of opioids in the United States, and they've had to pay huge settlements to communities affected by the opioid crisis in the United States. So certainly they are getting a lot of negative press, and there has been a lot of fantastic investigative journalism, particularly from these two journalists from the New York Times who also wrote a book that really kind of delves into the detail of some of these big scandals. So certainly they are getting more scrutiny, or there seems to be a kind of a kind of surge in scrutiny. But they of course that part of why they're able to continue to secure these contracts is because over many decades they have invested in creating a perception of legitimacy. And the historian Christopher D. McKenna, for example, looks at how in the 1960s McKinsey began its strategy of recruiting primarily from elite universities in the United States. So it would recruit from Harvard Business School, for example. And it did this not because it necessarily believed that these were the smartest brains, but because it helped to create a perception that this was a legitimate business. Because consulting, anyone can call themselves a consultant. Consulting isn't a regulated profession like law or auditing or accounting are. And so instead, the consultancies have had to engage in all of these different strategies to kind of build this reputation. It's also a very, the large firms are also very powerful within the sector. So most people work for small consultancies, but at least when we've done, some kind of analysis of which actors are getting the contract, it remains to be the largest firms. So they have a kind of a power that is contingent on their reputation for being able to give advice. That is a consequence of these kind of efforts to create legitimacy over many decades.
I mean, you mentioned the opioid crisis. It's quite amazing reading through the book, like how many horrible pies these organizations have their fingers in, right? And I think, like you said, it's not them. They're not the pharmaceutical company that produced opioids, right? But then it's like, yeah, they just seem to be involved in some of the worst things that have happened over the past few decades, allegedly. I don't want to get you into trouble, but yeah. So, yeah, I wanted to ask you about cost cutting. So, You talk about this actually quite late in the book. So I'd say most people, if they thought of consultancy and management consultancy, they probably think, well, what they do is they just go in and they provide cover for firing people, basically. That's the idea. Now we've talked about like sort of failed provision of services and everything, but to what extent is that true? To what extent has that been their function, just to cut costs, mostly workers, and provide cover for the client to do that?
Certainly in industry and with corporate clients, which are still the biggest, corporate clients make up the bulk of contracts that the large companies get. Certainly in those cases, this appears to be really common. When we did interviews with, I mean, if you know consultants, which I'm sure, or people who've worked for one of the larger firms, one of the kind of big complaints of one of the reasons why a lot of junior consultants or younger consultants become quite quickly disillusioned with the sector is because they feel that they are going in and just providing cover for a decision that's already been made by an executive, like a CEO or a CFO, for example, within an organization. And so they don't feel like they're actually, creating meaningful change or offering anything new. They are legitimating what has already been a decision that's already been made internally. In government, we do see this as well. But I think we can look to, so Andrew Sturdy, who's an academic at the University of Bristol, uses this acronym FEEL to describe the different reasons or the different roles that consultants can play when they're brought in to work for clients. So that's they act as facilitators, extras. So that's when they're brought in as kind of extra capacity, as we saw during the pandemic in particular. Experts, when they're kind of brought in because there is a perception that they really have expertise, or being brought in for legitimators. Feel that the final one is L, legitimators. And I think in government, we do see cases where perhaps, or we can point to instances where, within kind of struggles within government departments, we might see that a minister or a senior bureaucrat contracts a consultancy to kind of help kind of add the meat to their argument when they are trying to make the case for something internally. But I think that's certainly much more common as a reason why they're brought in the private sector.
I mean, how do they and we've touched on this, right? But like, how do they tend to deal with this kind of like this bad press? Because there's ways of covering themselves, and it goes back to what we were talking about before with like hiding in plain sight, right? But what kind of things do they do when they're exposed to scandal?
Yeah, I know. So I guess I didn't really answer this earlier. I kind of talked more about how structurally they maintain a position at all and how they're able to get contracts. But I think what's really interesting is you will notice if you follow kind of reporting or media about the consulting industry, it's very rare that they actively, will engage in media stories. And I think that's quite important here. So we saw in the case of when the kind of settlement was reached between McKinsey and communities in the United States, then we did start to see statements from McKinsey in the Australian Senate inquiry. PwC, which has been at the heart of another scandal, which we didn't talk about in the book because it happened as the book was published, but PwC and a number of other firms have been involved in or have had to give evidence as part of the Senate inquiry. But generally, the individual firms do not respond to to kind of critical reports about their work. Sometimes you might see one of the industry bodies, so like the Management Consultancies Association in the UK, for example, when Marianna, the co-author of The Big Con and my PhD supervisor, she gave a great interview with the Financial Times that ended up being the Financial Times most read article across all platforms last year.
Oh, wow.
And in response to that, the Management Consulting Association wrote a letter kind of challenging some of the things that we say in the book. So occasionally you see it, but it doesn't tend to come from the companies themselves. So in response to our book, we've been contacted by consultancies and by senior people within the companies, but privately, but they haven't made any statements in response to the book, for example. And that's the same for When McKinsey Comes to Town, which was the other book that I mentioned earlier.
So there's two aspects to this image that they maintain, right? It's one of them is what you've spoken about in depth, which is, appearing as experts and establishing trust and establishing relationships in the first place. And then the second one is what they do when some inevitable scandal breaks. And that seems to be, sort of responding intellectually, I suppose, in a way. But generally it's about like individuals, right? This is what I'm hearing. It's not the firm, McKinsey itself doesn't often seem to get in trouble. It might be one manager, or it might just be like a specific problem that's engulfed in scandal, but it never seems to get beyond that to like, let's question the industry as a whole.
Yes, I mean, I think that's completely correct. I think a lot of the critiques, and this is, again, why we see a lot of value, huge, immense value in investigative journalism and the work that investigative journalists have done to look at this sector. But it's also why we try to go a bit beyond this, because when you focus on the scandals alone, you aren't able to see the kind of the broader dynamics that are driving the scandals in the first place. And, there are many cases or many instances of value extraction and harms that come from the sector that, frankly, are within areas that no one wants to read about, like back office IT contract deals do not get the same attention as, when they go wrong as, McKinsey's involvement in the opioid crisis, because, I mean, obviously it's kind of obviously less harmful, but also it's less interesting, right, to media readers. But we would argue they're part of the kind of similar dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, and this is again, this is exactly where your book comes in, and you did mention a critique and a response from the consulting industry. So I actually haven't seen this. I mean, what's their line on the book, if there is one?
Well, I don't. Again, so it's hard to say. So the way that the industry associations work is that they bring together lots of consultancies, big and small. I will try to pull up exactly what they set so this was the Management Consultancies Association, which was the UK body management. I won't pull it up. That takes time. But everyone's welcome to go and look at it.
Yeah.
Obviously we welcome critique always, but they essentially, from what I can remember, this letter which came from the CEO to the Financial Times basically just said consultancies actually create value. They they do have expertise, basically kind of just challenging everything that we said, which is what we would expect.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder what their specific arguments are, or if many of them have actually read the book, to be honest. I wonder if live chat can, if anybody can go and find that and maybe post the quotes in the chat. You can't post links, but they could maybe post the quotes, and I can read it out. I want to ask you a slightly different question. This is a very brief part in the book, but you touched on one of my favorite historical case studies of sexism, right? And favorite inverted commas, right? But it's the computing industry in the UK. So this always really fascinated me. So the computing industry in the UK in like the 60s was dominated by women, and then there was this gradual sort of so the computing was considered sort of boring and administrative back then, and women were paid in girl hours, like literally, and you argue that there was this, as women were kind of evicted from the computing industry, which is a process I was aware of, and actually we kind of torpedoed our computer industry basically because of sexism, as far as I can tell, in the UK. But you also say that the masculinization of it went hand in hand with the growth of outsourcing and consulting. So this was a transformation of it from this boring administrative government expertise that was primarily done by women into this flashy, more shallow corporate. And I mean, how did this happen? Could you speak more about this? Because I found it fascinating.
Well, I think you've just described it fantastically. I think, we basically look at this, well, we suggest this by reading these two different literatures, which on the one hand, we're looking at, the work of Ma Hicks, for example, which documents the kind of history of labour in the UK, in UK government and UK sector computing, and the role of the computing sector, and its transition from being this kind of feminized to masculinized form of labour. So that's kind of that body of literature on the one hand. On the other hand, there is some research, and I have to in particular point to work by Antonio Weiss that he did for his PhD. He's a consultant and has a PhD in history that looked at the history of consulting in the UK government from the 1960s until 2010. And so, he has some excellent case studies, and his PhD was based on very rich archival research, looking at the growing involvement of Arthur Anderson, for example, in the UK public sector. So we kind of read between these two literatures suggest that there is likely a relationship between the two of them.
I mean, is the 60s, is that a good marker for generally when this trend started to emerge?
So, I mean, Antonio points to the 60s as being really important for the growth of consultancies in the UK government in particular. And we certainly see in the UK, not so much in the US, because there were rules, for example, preventing IBM from both providing IT infrastructure and providing advice on the management and implementation of this infrastructure within the US. There was kind of antitrust legislation around that. But in the UK, we see the growth of consulting, really kind of, or part of what spurred the growth in consulting was in UK government was the increased adoption of computers and computerization, within government.
It's interesting that we didn't have the rules against it, but the US did. I mean, I guess this would have been reversed in like the 80s in the US, right, with the antitrust changes then.
Yeah, it was in the 1990s that the rule, I can't remember which one it was, but the antitrust rule preventing IBM from I think it was actually specific to IBM, preventing them from providing IT consulting advice. And it was actually, and then it was during that period that IBM kind of exploded onto the scene in IT consulting, and became the kind of powerhouse of IT consulting that it is today.
So I do want to talk a little bit more now. You have touched on this, but I just want to be clear. Obviously, the name of the book, the content of the book, and the content of this interview has been very critical of the consulting industry. But I actually, probably my favorite chapter is chapter 5, I think it is, where you kind of extend an olive branch, right? And that's the chapter, if I'm not wrong, where you're sort of you're quite sympathetic to the people who go into consulting, what they're trying to do, and the people in government as well. And I mean, what you talk about is the idea of a con, right? Which actually comes from the term confidence trick, which is quite a good little fact that I learned from the book. But you say, look, it's not just that everybody's being hoodwinked. There's a lot of sort of understandable beliefs and values going into this, and it's a systemic problem. Everybody's trying to do the right thing, including the consultants themselves. So I don't know if there are any angry consultants listening, but could you maybe extend that olive branch to them?
No, absolutely. I mean, I've been challenged on this a bit. Some people have said we're very, very nice, and kind of too nice almost about why people choose to go in. I think there are lots of different reasons why people want to go into consulting, or why graduates might choose to go into them. And the kind of cynical view is that these are people who want to make money and, blah, 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 and everything like that. But when you look at the recruitment material, as we did, we studied quite extensively the recruitment material that consultancies use when they're trying to attract graduates in particular, and graduates of MBA programs, to come and work for them. There is a strong emphasis on the promise that, if you come and work for us, you will be at the forefront of the green transition. You will be helping to drive change across our societies and our economies. We will also support your learning and development, because you'll get lots of experience in lots of different countries. And of course, you can't get away from the fact that these are also positions that enable people, that will pay people enough to be able to rent in London or San Francisco or some of these places where many people cannot afford to live anymore, right? So there's a lot. So certainly there are people who might go into consulting because they really believe in that the kind of engine of society and what is good for the world is oiling the wheels of kind of never-ending profit accumulation, etc. But when you speak to many junior consultants in particular, many people do go into it for what we would say are good reasons, what you would put, kind of morally even describe as, or what you could describe as moral reasons. And we know that there has actually been a lot of the resistance within companies has also come from people who are trying to challenge the ways that the kind of role that consultancies are playing in enabling or greenwashing carbon emissions by clients. That hasn't necessarily been successful. We talk about the case of McKinsey in New York, where a number of consultants wrote a letter to senior partners calling on them to begin publishing details of the carbon emissions of McKinsey's biggest clients, and the partners basically refused to do that. So I'm not suggesting that these are successful strategies, but that also gets to the fact that this is largely a structural issue, a problem with the kind of the business model of consulting and its relationship with the rest of our economies.
Yeah, so the high salaries, especially relative to the public sector, are one thing, right? And surely that attracts people, and that can also, like you said, be fair enough in a sort of cost of living crisis. But there is also this issue of values, right? And I mean, I know people who are the most social justice warrior people ever, who've gone into places like KPMG, and just like, because there's not necessarily many other places that offer you the feeling that you're making a difference.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I mean, also the other the other side of that is that often they kind of lose faith in it a little bit after a few
Oh,
years.
absolutely. And even the Financial Times has written about this kind of growing disillusionment among young consultants. And, certainly, I mean, people listening, and I'm sure you as well also know people who've been in consulting, and they might still feel that they got a lot out of it in terms of their kind of personal development, but they became very disillusioned with the sector. I would say some of them, and that was, I've been asked quite a few times what was the most surprising finding that came out of doing the research for the book, and I would say that I was surprised by how kind of extensive this like general skepticism about the role of the sector is among junior consultants. Um, you know, I think it's very widespread.
Yeah, yeah. It, se- it seems to be quite generalized among people even outside the consulting industry, right? A skepticism of the industry that you're in. These days, when you speak to people, you get it all the time. I think
Yeah.
academics get it as well as YouTubers, I have to say. So you mentioned the climate, right, in that, and I really wanted to ask you about this because this is what your research is on. Your research outside the book, there's a whole chapter on it in the book, and there was a case study that really caught my eye. So this was McKinsey, I think, doing climate analysis, and they recommended banning the slash and burn practices of indigenous peoples rather than the deforestation practices of corporations. Why? Because corporations produce an immeasurable economic benefit, whereas the indigenous peoples don't. Right. So, I mean, could you speak to some of these issues? Because it's just mind-boggling to me, that kind of anti-democratic approach to the environment.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. I mean, so I think this is I have a new academic paper that's open access. This is a little bit of self-promotion with one of my colleagues here at Copenhagen Business School, another postdoc, Rasmus Calling Christensen, where we delve a bit more into the we have a chapter in the book that kind of speaks to the emergence of climate consulting. And the new paper that I've written delves into some of the challenges and the roles that consultancies are playing and the functions or the tasks that they are being put to in green transitions governance by public sector organizations. So they're involved in, for example, analysis, underpinning strategies, or also the design of net zero and carbon neutrality strategies. So we saw that in Australia when Australia launched its net zero strategy at COP in 2021. It was ranked 60th out of 60 by, I can't remember the name of the organization that does the rankings, but basically because it wouldn't enable Australia to get to net zero by 2050. I think it was only 85% of the way to net zero. So that's, obviously a big failure in a net zero strategy. And then, it quickly transpired that McKinsey had been involved in and done most of the analysis underpinning this. But this comes back to this tension and, between is this failure or is this kind of quite myopic approach to green transitions that is premised on, maintaining existing kind of growth structures or sources of growth and existing incumbent sectors? Is that demand coming from the governments that, also want to protect these interests as part of their kind of broader growth strategy, as part of the reproduction of their economic growth models? Or is this coming from consultancies acting on behalf, either directly or kind of inadvertently, on behalf of the sectors that they are trying to represent? Because there are also huge conflicts of interest. This was pointed out in the Australian case, where I'm going to get the number wrong, but I think it was these kind of commentators pointed out that McKinsey had also been advising 53 of the 100 biggest polluters, and therefore, doesn't necessarily, or therefore it would be kind of against the interests of its clients or of its biggest clients for governments to implement actually effective net zero strategies. So there are some of these critiques. But yeah, I think the big question, and this is why this is I'm primarily doing qualitative and a case study research at the moment. And I think this is why doing that sort of thing is important, because we'll see differences between them a bit from case to case.
Yeah. It's kind of, I mean, Keir Starmer, right? He's in the UK for the Labour Party. He seems to have committed to like a pro-growth strategy, and I suppose it's like this chicken and egg problem again. It's like, is the impetus coming from him to like retain growth, and then that's what structures McKinsey doing an analysis that tries to retain profitability and incomes as well, or is it how they're hijacking these kind of agendas? I mean, I'm not going to ask you to solve that problem, because it's obviously like what your research is on, right? It's is really difficult. I mean, one question I have for you, which is maybe a bit left field. I'm interested in environmental economics, and to what extent do these consultancies use kind of environmental economics ideas like cost benefit analysis, the kind of models that seem to imply like trade-offs between environmental and economic costs, that maybe lead them to some of these conclusions, like the indigenous conclusion, because they don't think about incommensurability and rights and things like that. I mean, are those widespread, you found?
Oh, absolutely. And I guess this speaks to your kind of wider work and interest, right? So we discuss in both the case of Australia's net zero strategy and in the case that you mentioned, where the UNFCCC contracted McKinsey to, do this analysis as part of its REDD Plus facility. So that was the reforestation and something like prevent the REDD Plus was the kind of facility for preventing deforestation and degradation of forests. So it's a kind of to assess kind of which policies would be supported by this facility for governments to be able to access this funding. They used a marginal abatement cost curve, which is the kind of model that was used to make this assessment that ended up coming to this conclusion that preventing, I guess that the crude summary of it was that preventing logging by these quite powerful industries was going to would cost more than paying indigenous communities to stop slash and burn practices, even though obviously preventing industrial logging would be much more effective, because it would be so much more expensive proportionally. Therefore, they support initiatives that try to reduce indigenous slash and burn practices. So there's a kind of broader issue where, I mean, this is a broader issue with economic models or the kind of dominant ones that are being used in green transitions policy and planning, right? That many of these models provide cover for policies that are not effective or not as effective as alternatives.
Yeah, there's no sort of, it's like, I mean, environmental regulations in the past were maybe like the Clean Air Act, the original one in the US, were designed more with kind of red lines, right? Lines you don't cross, emissions you don't cross. And I think it's gone to a sort of a trade-off. Well, you can cross this line if you're producing enough profit, right? And that's the kind of thing that maybe the kind of model that McKinsey are following, really. So, I mean, you finished the book with a number of recommendations about how contracts could be priced, more transparency, and all of these really sensible recommendations. I mean, there was one question which started echoing around my head as I was reading the book. And if you do address this and I've missed it, then sorry. But what about just nationalizing a lot of these companies?
Yeah, I think that I've been asked that a few times. And this is the nice thing about writing a book that so many people have read, and it's an honor that so many people have read it. But the nice thing about it is that lots of people also come up with alternative suggestions, or often like more radical proposals than we came to in the book, as things that governments can do. We're also, trying to speak to governments quite broadly. Obviously, different governments have got different institutional arrangements. So how we don't go into details about how exactly government should mandate transparency around conflicting interests, for example, because that would look different in every setting. Now, should we nationalize these companies? I think is a great question. And I would argue no, because they're not. I don't think it's really in the public interest to have these companies on the scale and scope that they exist to do today. So, nationalizing them in order to, manage their decline. There might be parallels with proposals that we have for the fossil fuel industry is one thing, but I think there are other ways to decline, to manage the decline of the sector. Or to manage the transformation of the sector that do not require its nationalization.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's simplistic. For me, I guess I don't. I mean, nationalisation isn't something that I usually love, and my followers hate to hear me say that. But I don't usually love nationalisation. I guess it was the historical process of this like hollowing out of governments and people going to consultancy instead, and there being a brain drain from one to the other, right? And so I was like, well, just bring them back, right? Just bring them back. But I don't know, maybe that's not the best way of doing it.
But I mean, I agree with that, and that's really what our proposals, what we
Yeah,
get to calls for.
yeah,
It's reinvesting in government capabilities in particular, and this require if we recognize, if we think about the reasons again why people go into consulting in the first place, or why it is an
yeah,
attractive career. There are some elements of this that I think would be useful for governments to think about if they are interested in developing or rebuilding capacity internally. The UK public sector has had a pay freeze for a very long time. In many places, there is a civil service fast stream, but very few people, or the at least in the courses that I graduated from, people still want to go, which are both political science courses. People still want to go and work for consultancies rather than work for government. So how do we make governments, an attractive and interesting place for people to want to work? Well, that is about the pay. It's also about helping people to recognize, is about who is in power, but it's also helping people to recognize that governments are able to play a role as being kind of drivers of transformation of economies towards carbon neutrality and beyond. In a sense, that's nationalization, because it's nationalization of capacity insofar as
yeah.
we want to bring a lot of that back in house. But I don't think the model of the companies is a particularly effective way to do that.
You'd rather build it from the ground up and actually improve it rather than just, McKinsey's now been nationalised and then you've got to deal with all of the baggage that entails, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
right, yeah.
This speaks to the question that we kind of avoided right at the beginning, just because I wanted to get into the specific details, but it's this broader ideological project, right? And obviously, Marianna Mazzucatto, your co-author and supervisor, has sort of, arguably been leading this project to this shift away from the idea of the state as something which can only extract value, or at best is neutral and provides the foundations for the market economy. But really, there are so many examples throughout history of the state creating value that I think we need to re-embrace that, right?
Yeah, and I think there's always politics involved, and this is something that I think is really important to kind of caveat our arguments about the role of the state. We also shouldn't assume that the state is going to be a benevolent actor that is always going to, that capable states will act in the interests of citizens, or in a way that is always democratic, etc. But it's foundational for governments to be able to do the things. If we do want if we do have transformative politics and transformative political economy or economics, then it's foundational that the state needs to be able to have the capabilities to pursue those agendas for them to be able to be realized, right? So we require states to be able to achieve these things that we think are important.
Yeah. So I mean, are there? I mentioned the UK election. Are any of the parties? Any of the parties seem major or minor? That any of them seem committed to that kind of vision? Would you say?
I mean, it's a good question. I haven't I've been busy working on a paper this week, so I haven't looked that much into it, but I have been tagged on Twitter in some things around both Labour and the Conservatives have now committed to cutting consulting spend,
Oh, cool.
which is great. I need to read a bit more about it. I think that's just maybe again people watching will know more about it than I well, I probably should have read a bit more about it before joining today, but it's happened over the past few days. Um, yeah, in terms of to what extent any of the parties in the UK have a transformative economic agenda, I would argue no, absolutely not. And where kind of elements of it exist, they're not comprehensive. Yeah, I probably can't offer much more of a critical
Yeah.
analysis than what has been said elsewhere. But no, I'm not super optimistic about the kind of economic ambition of any of the main parties.
No, and every time they commit to it, or at least Labour commit to it, they then seem to to go back on it. Somebody says in chat, can you give an example of the state creating value with less than 25 words? I mean, the internet would be my answer. That's just 2 words. I don't know what your answer to that is, Rosie.
Um, I don't really understand the question.
An
The
example of the state creating value. There is also a condition of less than 25 words, so it's quite an aggressive question, to be honest.
Yeah, wow. Is it because I'm wordy?
Uh,
I've I'm
uh,
at the end of a long week of preparing for conferences, so apologies if I've been wordy.
that's
Um,
yeah. That wasn't my interpretation. I just think somebody just wanted a neat example.
The NHS, I mean, the NHS was a transformative economic project. There were lots of things that went, and now I'm going beyond 25 words, but there were lots of factors that drove the decision to establish the NHS. But one of them was a commitment to improve welfare for citizens, and it was successful in creating hospitals, in developing a health system that went across the UK that also ended up resulting in medical research breakthroughs. Again, we discuss this in the book. And really that could be a blueprint for other transformative like strategic thinking.
I mean, you go into this, yeah, the things the NHS has actually done, especially in its early years. The first simultaneous heart, kidney, liver transplant, was
Exactly.
it?
Yeah,
Yeah. A few things, hip replacements. That it's easy to forget that the NHS has been a pioneer of quite a lot of treatments.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I am aware that you have lots of work to do, and we've spoken for about an hour. We've got through literally all of my questions, so it's been contrary to what you just said. I think it's actually been very concise, and there's been a lot of information packed in. So thanks so much for joining me, Rosie.
No, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining. I can't see anyone, but nice to know you're there. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, I'll see you.
Speak to you soon. Bye.